Story 1. The quiet tenant. Clara always told herself the Blackwood house was just a house. A big, old, wealthy house, with too many wings and an unsettling proximity to the dense, shadow-choked woods that lined the edge of town. It wasn't haunted, it was just unloved. She was here on a recommendation from a friend, a last-minute gig for the notoriously private Blackwoods. Mr. Blackwood, a man composed entirely of stiff, dark wool and strained politeness, had given her a list of rules long enough to be its own legal document. The thermostat was not to be touched. The kitchen's back pantry was locked and off limits. And under no circumstances was she to go into the basement study, even if a fire broke out. Leo is 6, Mrs. Blackwood, pale and drawn, whispered, her eyes constantly darting toward the heavy mahogany staircase. He's a quiet child. He'll be asleep by 8. Just be quiet, Clara. The house, it likes quiet. Leo was already in bed when they left, a small, still lump under an antique quilt in a room that smelled faintly of old wood smoke and dust. He hadn't even stirred when his parents kissed his forehead goodbye. By 8:30 p.m., Clara was alone. The house absorbed all sound. The silence was so profound it felt pressurized, like something heavy sitting on her chest. She found the living room, a vast space dominated by a cold stone fireplace and dark portraits with accusing eyes. She tried to watch a movie, but the volume had to be kept so low that the dialogue was just a murmur. She jumped when the landline phone, a relic of brass and bakelite, rang. It was an anachronism in the modern mansion, but the Blackwoods had insisted it was the only line that worked properly. Ring. Ring. Clara picked up, her voice shaky. Hello. Blackwood residence. A man's voice, rough and distorted, filled the receiver. It wasn't Mr. Blackwood. It sounded like static trying to speak. Clara, I need you to check the children. Clara frowned, her stomach sinking. I'm sorry, sir, Leo is asleep. He's the only child here. There was a strange, wet chuff sound on the line, like a sigh coming from a throat lined with sandpaper. No, not Leo. The other ones. The ones in the walls. I need you to check if they're still hungry. Clara gasped, nearly dropping the heavy receiver. Who is this? This isn't funny. I'm calling the police. The man chuckled, a dry, rattling noise. Don't worry, girl. They don't like the police. They only like quiet. And you've been so quiet. The line went dead. Clara stood frozen for a full minute, her heart hammering against her ribs. Prank call. Had to be. Some horrible friend of the Blackwoods trying to scare the new sitter. She took a deep, shuddering breath and walked to the nearest window, pulling aside the heavy velvet curtain. Complete, isolating darkness. No cars, no streetlights, only the inscrutable woods. She decided to check on Leo one last time, just to reassure herself. She crept up the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step. Leo's door was slightly ajar. She pushed it gently. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight filtering through the tall window. The small lump under the quilt hadn't moved. Everything was fine. She was being silly. As she turned to leave, a faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears. It was coming from the floor vent near the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a delicate, precise noise, like a fingernail gently ticking against metal. Clara knelt down, her ear inches from the brass grate. The grate was old and dust-caked, screwed tightly into the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped. Clara waited. Nothing. Just the profound silence of the Blackwood house returning. She stood up, trying to rationalize it as wind, or maybe a pipe contracting. But the house was unnaturally still. She glanced over at Leo's bed. That's when she saw it. On the wall right next to the headboard, just above where Leo's head rested. The wallpaper, a thick, floral pattern, was subtly rippled. But it wasn't a ripple of moisture. It was a slight, circular bulge, about the size of a child's hand. And, as she watched, the bulge moved. It pressed out against the paper from the inside, paused, and then slowly began to move down, tracing a path that eventually stopped level with the vent. A cold certainty, heavier than the silence of the house, settled over her. This wasn't a prank. This was a presence, and it was in the walls. The house wasn't unloved. It was already occupied. She backed away silently, her eyes locked on the wallpaper. The moment she reached the doorway, she heard a sound that wasn't a tap, but a deliberate, wet scrape. It was coming from Leo's open closet. She froze. The closet was deep, filled with the shadowy bulk of winter coats. Scrape. Louder this time, like something dragging across the bare floorboards inside. She slowly turned her head. A small, pale hand, not much bigger than the bulge she'd seen in the wall, was reaching out from between two coats. It was thin and dirty, and the fingers flexed, curling like hungry hooks, trying to grasp the air. Clara didn't scream. The Blackwood house liked quiet. She remembered Mrs. Blackwood's drawn face, Mr. Blackwood's rigid stance. They knew. They weren't afraid of a break-in. They were terrified of them being disturbed. She fled. Not down the main stairs, which would announce her panic with every echoing footfall, but straight to the linen closet at the end of the hall. She found the heavy fire escape ladder tucked inside, meant for the upper windows. She clawed her way out the second-story window, paying no mind to the glass that nicked her forearm. The night air was freezing, and the rough metal rungs burned her palms, but she scrambled down the side of the house in a frantic rush. When her feet hit the frozen lawn, she didn't look back at the upstairs window. She ran for the tree line, not caring where she went, just needing to be out from under the roof that contained the house's silent, ravenous children. She was halfway down the driveway when she heard the sound from behind the house. It wasn't a howl or a roar. It was a high-pitched, childish, yet unnervingly satisfied giggle, followed by a faint, muffled sound, like a 6-year-old boy trying desperately to hold his breath forever. The Blackwood house had settled back into its silence. And Clara knew, with chilling finality, that whatever had been hungry was now quiet. And Leo, the quiet child, had served his purpose. She never stopped running until the first signs of dawn touched the horizon. She never called the police, because what would she say? I think your neighbors feed their only son to the things that live between the walls. She just disappeared. Another babysitter who couldn't handle the Blackwood silence, leaving the job, and the house, to await its next quiet tenant. Story 2. The Perimeter's promise. Elara always took the summer jobs in the wealthy north end of town. The houses were expansive, the air conditioning was powerful, and the parents were always too distracted by their own lives to care much about hers. Tonight was the Ashworths, a new client, notorious for their Gothic revival mansion set back on a winding, overgrown property far from any streetlights. She had met Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth briefly. They were a study in strained elegance. Thin, sharp, and perpetually dressed in slightly too formal clothes. Their 10-year-old daughter, Phoebe, was the only thing that gave Elara pause. Phoebe wasn't unruly, quite the opposite. She was meticulously neat, too silent, and possessed eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older and much warier. She wore a floor-length white nightgown that looked less like children's sleepwear and more like something out of a Victorian portrait. She's very sensitive to light and noise, Mrs. Ashworth had explained, her voice low and frantic as she hurried Elara through the cavernous foyer. And she has her routines. Just follow them. Don't deviate. The parents left at 9 p.m. on the dot, vanishing down the long, dark drive in a car that sounded muffled, as if the forest was already muffling sound. Elara settled onto the impossibly grand sofa in the living room, pulling out her phone. The Wi-Fi password was a complicated string of numbers and symbols. The signal was patchy. At 9:15 p.m., Phoebe emerged from the shadows of the hallway. She didn't walk. She glided. "You've read the notes, haven't you, Elara?" Phoebe's voice was reedy, emotionless. "Yes, sweetie. You're supposed to be in bed, though. The notes are incomplete," Phoebe stated, sitting on the opposite end of the couch, spine arrow straight. "They only tell you how to care for me. They don't tell you how to care for the house." Elara lowered her phone. This was definitely a new one. "Okay, Phoebe. Tell me about the house." Phoebe looked at Elara, her dark eyes unnervingly steady. "The house has 4 things you must do. They are for the other one. If you break them, the perimeter opens, and the other one gets closer." Elara forced a smile, playing along with what she assumed was an elaborate, creepy game. "All right. What are the things I must do?" Phoebe began to speak, her voice flat, reciting a strange liturgy. The first duty involved the main hall closet. It was not for coats, but for the lock. After 10 p.m., Elara must place the chair exactly 6 inches from its door. No closer. No farther. Then there was the mirror upstairs. After 11 p.m., she must not, under any circumstances, stand directly in front of the tall, uncovered mirror in the upstairs corridor for longer than 10 seconds. 10 was the maximum count. And the landline phone, she was told to never answer it. No matter how many times it rang, no matter how long it rang. She had to let it ring out. "But the boundary is the most important," Phoebe finished, her voice dropping. "You must never step on the boundary lines. Not in the kitchen, not in the living room, and especially not in the upstairs hall. The boundaries keep the other one contained in the between." Elara swallowed hard. "The boundaries." Phoebe pointed a slender finger at the floor. The immense, ancient Persian rug that filled the living room had a deep, mahogany wood trim running around its edge, slightly raised from the surrounding floorboards. "That is the living room perimeter," Phoebe whispered. "If you step on it, you invite the shadow in." Phoebe rose soundlessly, gave one last piercing look at the mahogany trim, and disappeared up the massive staircase. The boundary of the kitchen. At 9:55 p.m., Elara was in the brightly lit kitchen, making herself a cup of tea. It was the only room that felt remotely normal. Then she saw the kitchen boundary. A thin, dark gray stripe of tile, about an inch wide, ran around the entire periphery of the room, separating the white marble work area from the polished hardwood dining nook. She carefully avoided stepping on it. At 10 p.m., a loud, metallic clang echoed from the main hall. Elara froze. The sound had come from the main hall closet, the one Phoebe said held the lock. She approached the closet and found a heavy, antique wooden chair near the entryway. She measured out 6 inches, about the length of her phone, from the closet door and placed the chair there, fulfilling the first instruction. Clang. A second sound came, fainter, but distinctly from beneath the closet. It sounded like something attempting to drag itself across stone. Elara retreated to the living room, feeling the profound unease settle in. She glanced down at the living room rug. The mahogany trim gleamed under the soft lamps. She found herself subconsciously standing 4 feet away from it, treating it like a high-voltage wire, adhering strictly to the perimeter instruction. The voice and the vision. It was 10:45 p.m. The house had settled into an uncomfortable quiet. Then, the landline phone, sitting on a small marble table near the front door, began to ring. 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 The instruction was clear. Do not answer it. Elara fought the almost irresistible urge to break the silence. Ring, ring, ring. On the fifth ring, the sound changed. It wasn't the phone's regular tone anymore. It was a distorted, choked sound, like a recording of a desperate voice being played through a broken speaker, interspersed with the ring. It sounded like it was struggling to say her name. Elara. She clamped her hands over her ears, retreating further into the living room until the ringing abruptly stopped, leaving behind only the echoing silence. She checked the time. 11:03 p.m. Now for the instruction concerning the upstairs mirror. She walked toward the upstairs corridor. At the far end stood a massive, silver-framed mirror. She pulled out her phone and started a timer. She took one step forward, planting herself directly in front of the glass. 1,000. 1,000. Then she saw it. Not behind her in the hallway, but in the reflection of the hallway. In the glass, a figure materialized in the shadows near the staircase. It was tall and gaunt, its movements an unnerving inversion of natural gait, and it was moving toward her, but only in the mirror. 1,000. 1,000. As the reflected figure drew closer, its face was a blurred, elongated version of Phoebe's, a face that looked hungry and absolutely delighted to see her. Its skeletal, multi-jointed fingers were scraping across the reflected wallpaper. 1,000. She backed away, stumbling, shattering the direct line of sight before she reached the maximum 10-second count. The reflected figure vanished immediately. Elara backed away from the mirror. She glanced down at the hallway floor. The perimeter here was a mosaic of tiny, chipped, obsidian-colored stones running around the edge of the hall. She stepped only in the center of the oak planks, terrified of that dark, ritualistic line. The broken Elara's mind was reeling. She was running on pure, terrified instinct. The rules were a form of containment, and the Ashworths hadn't hired a sitter. They had hired a warden. She heard a new sound now, faint but inescapable. It was a whisper, coming from the floorboards near the mosaic perimeter. It sounded like dried leaves being scuffed. Scuff, scuff. Elara crept down the stairs, trying to keep her feet strictly on the middle of each step, away from the edges. The scuffing sound followed her, traveling along the boundaries. She dashed into the kitchen, careful to jump the gray-tiled kitchen border, landing in the safe, white marble center. The sound stopped instantly. A loud, furious thump came from the living room side of the wall. It sounded like something large, heavy, and angry was pressing itself against the drywall. She ran for the back door, located just past the dining nook. To get there, she had to cross the dining nook section of the hardwood floor. As she ran, her foot slipped. She instinctively put her hand down to catch herself. Her palm landed flat on the gray-tiled perimeter line. The sound that followed was an overwhelming, echoing shatter, as if every window in the house had cracked simultaneously. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted. The air smelled powerfully of cold earth and rot. From the dark corner of the dining nook, a figure slowly began to form. It coalesced rapidly into the shape of Phoebe, but with arms far too long, dangling past its knees, and a face stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. It was stepping off the gray tile and onto the hardwood. The perimeter was open. "You shouldn't have stepped on the gray," the creature hissed, its voice a collection of whispers, dry and rasping. "Now I can stay." Elara realized she couldn't fight it. She had to use the rules against it. The creature was a reflection, an inversion, a thing of boundaries. She turned and ran, flying back through the main hall. As she passed the main hall closet, the chair she had carefully positioned 6 inches away flew across the room and shattered, allowing the lock to open. A sound like 1,000 tiny hands scratching wood erupted from within. She ran past the landline. It started ringing instantly, a continuous, high-pitched shriek that vibrated in her teeth. She pounded up the stairs, knowing the shadow Phoebe was right behind her. She reached the massive, uncovered mirror at the end of the corridor. The reflected Phoebe was 10 feet behind her. Elara stopped directly in front of the mirror. She looked deep into the glass, and began counting, fast and loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. ... The reflected Phoebe, about to touch her, froze. Elara kept counting, her voice shaking but firm. 6, 7, 8, 9. ... As she reached 10, the creature's reflected image didn't vanish. It began to shimmer, violently. Elara pushed past the limit. 11, 12, 13. She was forcing the rule to bind the nearest target, the reflection of the creature itself. The shadow Phoebe standing inches behind Elara began to spasm, its shadowy form flickering. Stop. You promised. The thing shrieked. Elara counted to 15. With a sound like tearing silk, the reflection of the shadow Phoebe collapsed into the mirror, turning into a black, oily stain that instantly soaked into the glass. The real shadow Phoebe standing behind Elara dissolved into the floorboards. The ringing stopped. The closet went silent. The house was utterly still once more. Elara didn't stop. She ran, flying down the stairs, grabbing her keys and her purse, and bursting out the front door. She never looked back at the house, running down the dark driveway until she reached the main road. The aftermath. Elara never told anyone exactly what happened. She left a vague text about an unforeseen emergency, and blocked the Ashworth's number. A week later, she saw a news clipping pop up on her phone, shared by a local neighborhood group. It was about the Ashworths. The article stated that Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth had returned home from their event the previous Saturday to find their 10-year-old daughter, Phoebe, missing. The police noted no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and the doors and windows were all securely locked. The only strange detail the police released was a note found pinned to the front door, written in Mrs. Ashworth's elegant, spidery script. The note was not addressed to the police. It was addressed to the next person who would be hired to care for the house. It read, "She is quiet now. You will know she is waiting for a new shape. The rules are crucial. The perimeter holds the boundary. The chair keeps the lock shut. But the vision is the most important. You must count to 20 if you want it to stay contained. 10 is not enough. 10 only frees the hungry one." Elara threw her phone across the room. She realized she hadn't saved herself by fully breaking the rules. She had merely swapped the prisoners. The creature was back inside its boundary, but the real Phoebe, the quiet child who knew the rules of the house, was gone. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.